Elie Ayache and Feigelfeld, the moderator of the conversation. It's about to start.
Hello everyone. Thanks for coming on this beautiful day and not staying outside. Or if you go outside, you can bring us more drinks. For the next hour or so, depending on how much you engage with us, we are going to talk about market transformations, which is just the title of the panel. In the end, we're going to talk about highly, highly complex technological concepts. And how they apply to philosophical concepts, which are even more complex, and how they might translate into various forms of our daily lives, such as the art world and other fields that touched it. I would just give a very, very brief introduction, basically just say their names once more, and then ask both Kei and Elie to give us a little introduction into what they do, because it's not something that that I could just give you an insight into in 10 seconds. And then afterwards we're going to dive into different terminologies, basically clear up what we're talking about. So the idea is that you're sincerely invited to interrupt at any point and ask really, really simple questions. This is also going to be my job as the moderator, is to ask really simple questions. From that, we thought that it would be nice to sort of open it up quite from the beginning and have it as a sort of seminar format. So we want you to engage in the discussion. We want to ask you why you are actually here, because judging from the description of the panel and also the concepts that we're talking about, it's quite exotic actually in this context. So without further ado, next to me I have the honor to introduce Kei Kreutler, who lives in Berlin, is a researcher, designer, and contrary to the program, not the creative, but the strategy director of Gnosis, which is a company that she will tell us a little bit more about in a minute. Her field of expertise gravitates roughly around the concept of blockchain, but is much more, which is a concept that you all have heard of, I'm sure. But our job today is also to kind of look a little bit closer at what blockchain actually is, because as is usually the case with highly complex technological things, is that especially these days, we hear a lot about them, but the more we hear about them, the less we understand what they're about. Next to Kei is Elie Ayache, who for over 20 years has worked in finance and is the CEO of a financial software company called ITO33. And in this context I met him 5 years ago, also the author of very, very interesting, hard to grasp but highly complex diamonds of books. The first one called The Blank Swan, The End of Probability, about which we fought 5 years ago at the conference that we met at first. And the second one called The Medium of Contingency. Elie is a very interesting figure because he sort of gravitates back and forth between the art world or this world of philosophy and theory and actually also the world of high finance. His specialty is derivative trading, and derivatives is something that is not easy to understand. I'm very happy after 5 years that I get to meet Elie again, because I might understand more than I did 5 years ago. So I would suggest we start with you, and I'm happy you're all here.
Good. Cool. Thanks everyone for coming. So thank you for the kind introductions as well, and the invitation and all of these. So as said, my name is Kei. So I originally studied philosophy. I've worked as an artist, but for the last 2 years I've worked as strategy at Gnosis. And Gnosis is a company a little bit original, kind of new historical formation, let's say, of a blockchain company. How many people here have heard of Ethereum? Okay, great. It's about 50%. So Gnosis builds on Ethereum, which is a software platform that uses blockchain. And to give a super quick, simple definition, I would say that blockchain is like having a consensus record of every action that's happened between a group of people. So you have something written down to say, I gave you $5, you gave me $10, but you could even extend it in the case of Ethereum to being something like, I give you some sort of social contract or something more complex or implicit. So working at Gnosis, we started originally as a prediction market platform. And the idea of prediction markets on top of blockchain are that you can not only make the outcomes or the price of stocks tradable, but you can make the outcome of any future event tradable. So there's kind of normal scenarios related to kind of sports or political or other fields that you can see this as a ready case, but you could literally apply these types of markets to any future outcome. And in the interim, we've also expanded so that we do trading protocols for low liquidity markets as well as a wallet. I think I'll leave it there for now, but I would say that one of the main reasons why I'm working in blockchain at the moment is because I think it allows a certain type of institutional critique with relatively low overhead that hasn't existed prior, and opens up a huge narrative space for thinking about collective organizing, but also thinking about what value and what finance and what the future is. I think that's sufficient for now.
All right, thank you. My name is Elie Ayache. I graduated from university 32 years ago, and the day I was hired by a bank was exactly the day when the market collapsed in '87. So my first day as a trader was actually the market crash in '87. So my first career was as a trader on the stock exchange, meaning in the actual physical place where a lot of people meet, and we call them the crowd. And there's an open outcry, meaning physically the persons are exchanging stocks in that situation by shouting the buying and selling orders and the prices at which they trade, and signaling by hand. I say it's physical because later the exchanges became electronic, more or less. And my specialty from the first day was not to trade the actual financial stock or the bond, but trade derivatives written on them, which I think I'll explain later. So these are financial contracts that all said are more complex than the basic stuff. But all you need to understand that now, it's a financial contract, so something that you buy and sell to another person in the exchange, which can be identified to bets that you make on the future price of something. So if a derivative is always written on something more basic, which is a stock or a currency or a commodity, and basically traders are going to take views, hence prediction. That's how it trades in predictions market also. Take views on what the value of gold or what the value of oil or what the value of Google is going to be in the future. And you buy and sell those derivatives which pay out money in case your bet turns out to be right, in case the stock or the currency has in effect traded above a certain level or below a certain level. So these contracts that we call derivatives are also exchanged on the floor. And my job was to trade them as a market maker. So I needed to produce prices for them. And in those days, the late 80s, banks would hire mathematicians because it turns out that we needed a statistical mathematical formula to evaluate those derivatives, and the main parameter, which is very important, is what we call volatility. So today I will basically talk to you about volatility, which is at least the one notion that you need to understand best, because everything is really contained in that volatility. So for 10 years I did that, and later, for the last 20 years, I created a company. So I'm no longer a physical trader myself. I did this for 10 years. But for the last 20 years, I've been running a company which develops software to evaluate derivatives on equities. And the company is, the software is very cutting edge. We have as customers major hedge funds and investment banks who deal with derivatives on equities, typically on equity indices like the S&P. So we're talking about huge and very liquid markets, finance. And today I'm very interested that the discussion would open this beyond finance, because here we talk about prediction markets at large, so not only predicting the value of stocks or financial assets, but also transacting bets on who's going to win the World Cup, or who's going to, if war is going to break or whatever. So I'm interested in this. And also the other thing that's interesting, because I'm old-fashioned, so she represents new technology, is that the exchange, where I used to go and trade with physical people, is no longer centralized today. If you move to a blockchain, it becomes decentralized, and the blockchain will actually take care of registering all the trades that happen.
So could you give us a clear definition of what you mean by volatility?
So, I mean, the main idea here is that, because I believe that you're also interested ultimately in the art market and such, and in the value of stuff, the value of the world. So the main assumption here is that value doesn't exist. Nobody knows the value of anything. Nobody knows the value of stocks or bonds. Nobody knows even the value of money, because you don't know, maybe tomorrow the dollar is going to become worthless and be replaced with Bitcoin. So nobody knows the value of anything at all. So my whole industry of derivatives is really predicated on the fact that value doesn't exist. There's only price. So the only thing that you know, and maybe knowledge is not the right word even, is the price at which, at an instant of time, something is traded at. So price only exists. And as soon as you say so, meaning people are going to exchange stuff typically in stock exchange, if you're exchanging an index or a stock. So there's the dimension of time that enters. You are giving away the stuff to somebody else who will hold it and giving you money in the meantime. So as soon as time enters, volatility enters. Because now that you no longer hold the asset, but you hold money instead of it, nobody knows the value of money. Maybe tomorrow there is hyperinflation, and therefore the price of the stuff is going to go to the roof, or maybe somebody else is going to sell the stuff. So as soon as you have people exchanging things against money, the price of that thing is going to fluctuate continuously. So if you look at graphs of prices of stuff that is traded on exchanges, and I mean it's trading continuously, there is no stop. If you take the dollar-euro exchange rate, it's continuously trading every second, and it is going to fluctuate, and volatility is the parameter that statistically measures, and there is a very neat mathematical definition of it, I'm not going to give it to you, but it statistically measures how wide and wild are the fluctuations of the price of that thing. So the more volatile the stock is, the more noise there is of its price. And as I said, because nobody knows the value, so it's only speculation. And Keynes had famously defined what was going on the stock exchange by comparing it to a beauty contest. So he says that it's a matter not of predicting or electing who is the most beautiful woman according to some fundamental criteria or judgment, but voting for the woman that you know that the rest of the crowd will vote as the most beautiful one. So there's a self-referential loop here. So if I buy a stock, it's not because I believe in the fundamental value of the company, because I don't know what that means. It's because I believe that other people would believe that the price will go up, and therefore it's pure speculation. I'm being a little bit radical here. I mean, I agree that a lot of people would be scared by that, but I'd rather be radical at first to really give you the sense of what I mean by price as opposed to value and by volatility.
So it's sort of a recursive dilemma. It's this game that I think, that you think, that I think, that you think, that I think, and then we meet somewhere at sort of a completely synthetically created concept of value, not even the value itself, but just the concept of it. I would like to ask you about the concept of time that you just introduced, which seems to me the only sort of steady core issue in there. Also maybe then later on leading over to Kia's work, because time is also of a big issue in blockchain because of the computation that are required to do that. So how does time come into play in this sort of market, and how would you define, could you give us a little insight into your concept of what a market is, because we have a very rough concept of what a market is, and when we were talking yesterday and today, you said some very interesting things about what a market actually is or could be. in the terms of the vectors it has.
Yeah, I mean, my basic definition is that as soon as you have something which I would generally call a contingent claim. So contingent claim is something that you buy that's going to give you some money in the future, but you don't know how much. So typically a bet is a contingent claim, because in case the event that you're betting on takes place, you earn $100, and in case it doesn't happen, you earn nothing. So that's a contingent claim because its value, the payout that's going to be in the future, hence the dimension of time, because we are talking about something that will return money to you in the future. So as soon as that value is contingent on some event, it's called a contingent claim, and you fall into the problem of what is the value that I need today? What is the price of the lottery ticket that I want to buy today? So as soon as you have that, and of course the dimension of time here is of essence, because we are basically talking about future events that are not known yet, so hence the contingency. So there's the dimension of time, and somebody who is scientifically minded will talk of probability at this juncture. So you say, to evaluate the lottery or to evaluate the bet, I need you to give me the probability of, I don't know, the World Cup being won by the French once again, etc. And this probability, you weigh up the events that will happen with the probability, and you compute what we call the fair value of the bet using probability. So that's the scientific view. However, that doesn't work, which is very later why. The simplest way of putting a value on a bet is to trade it in a market. So to me, the definition of a market, in the financial sense or the financial sense of prediction market, is the place where a crowd gathers, and simply by the consensus that emerges between the crowd, because somebody is offering at some price this bet. So for instance, let's bet if tomorrow it's going to rain or be sunny. If the contract, you make 100 euros if it's raining today and you make 0 if not, roughly the price would be around 50 today, the chances are 50-50. But it's not 50, it's going to be maybe 55, 60, depending on what the consensus in the crowd is, because they've heard of weather forecast or something like that. So a market is typically the place where the price is set up by the consensus of the crowd on these events that nobody knows what's going to happen. Weather is easy. Think about nuclear disaster, for instance. Think about insurance companies about selling contingent claims that cover events that never happen or might happen only once. In this case, you wouldn't need a market to determine the opposite.
Yeah, there's an interesting line for prediction markets that's something like vote values but bet beliefs. But you could say in a sense kind of vote values but bet prices. And the idea of a prediction market as well, it kind of extends to social performances too. So in the sense that you don't necessarily kind of have an inherent value that you're trying to estimate, you're almost performing a price and socially performing a price. As soon as the markets are applied to a kind of more social context, it becomes, I always think of it like putting a bounty on what the truth will be in terms of performing it through a market. So just to give one specific example of how prediction markets could be applied in the world, I think that is useful for the context that we'll be talking about, is this concept of futarchy. So in a way that it kind of performs over time, and it's very specific. So to give just a simple example, you could say some nation wants to decide whether to pass a healthcare bill. And they say they have like a national happiness score instituted, and like forget for a second all of the problematic ontological reasons why a national happiness score might not matter. But you say, if we pass this healthcare bill, say single-payer healthcare, will the national happiness score go up in the next 5 to 10 years by a certain amount of points? So everyone would participate in a market, and they would buy yes or no, and say, yes, the national happiness score will go up in 5 to 10 years. And they would actually put money on this decision. And then the market would close, and based on where the market was of, yes, if we pass this healthcare bill, the national happiness score will go up, then the healthcare bill would pass. But those holdings would be locked until the 5 to 10 year time period in which that actual decision will be made. So people would actually lose money based on whether the contingent factor that they staked on comes true or not. So this type of using markets to bet over time is something that's like very fundamental to extending this idea of, I would say, almost kind of placing derivatives on social outcomes and actually having holding over time in a set lock period.
So you see, we're actually talking about time travel. No, but I find it really interesting actually that talking about prediction in both cases, about outcomes of certain ideas and concepts, that we enter a stage which is something that extends to the whole of the technological condition, not just markets, but everything in our sort of era of computer simulation, where the prediction of a certain scenario becomes the production of this scenario. Maybe continuing with definitions from Elie, and since he's already defined you as the new generation, the younger generation, you could give us an insight into your idea of what markets are these days and how decentralization comes into play.
Well, I think there is something inherently different about a market that's not necessarily order book based. So in a kind of normal pricing market, you might have something where someone collects a bunch of orders on one side, on the buyer side or on the seller side, and then there's a spread between them of how much someone's willing to pay for something and how much someone's willing to sell for something. With decentralized markets, it could be that software or blockchain acts as this mediator, navigating the spread, but it could also be done in more batches, and it doesn't necessarily have to be semantically or kind of humanistically computed, but it can be done through a series of different consensuses. So one thing that we work on at Gnosis is the idea of conditional tokens. So these are tokens that actually take part in several markets at once. So it could be something in the sense of if a hard Brexit happens, will the pound go up or down? And those could be represented as two markets or one interdependent market, with the actual asset that's at stake being more semantically rich and representing multiple different outcomes. So suddenly when you get kind of more non-custodial software infrastructure, basically you open up the realm for it to not necessarily be kind of mediated in a similar way. So decentralized markets to me represent the ability to have much more complex semantic information embedded into a single asset price very directly.
So you're talking about an asset that pays out different amounts of money depending on Brexit, say in this case?
Yep, and it could be...
It's a monthly scenario, not only that and one.
Yeah. You could call it conditional payout.
Yeah, or contingent claim in my case. And so you're saying this is now being exchanged on like blockchain exchanges? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Enter the seminar stage now. Yeah, but I find it highly interesting because it dawned, like yesterday we had this moment when we had a prep talk, that it's actually very closely related what both of you are doing, in both a spatial and a temporal way in a way. I mean, of course it's a further development, blockchain technology from the derivatives market. It's sort of historically contingent that they are connected in a way. But also from the way conceptually they are addressing things, it seems that they are sort of addressing different sides of the same issue, or maybe with different philosophical approaches. What do you think about that?
I think, no, blockchain is just how you implement the actual operation process of the market, right? So nothing stops, like maybe tomorrow or maybe the actual S&P, the index to be traded on blockchain, right?
Yeah, but there are a few new technical hurdles, like with anything else. So how blockchain in a rough way works is that kind of people submit transactions, miners mine them, and a certain amount of transaction goes in every block. And you can think of that like it's like a page in a guest book or something. So there's a certain amount of signatures in a guest book that can fit on one page, and then you have to flip to the next page. So one block is a certain amount of finite transactions that happen, and then you flip to the next block, and then a certain amount of computation has to be done again. So this opens up new technical hurdles in the sense that, for instance, there's a few, but for instance, one of them is that miners who do computational work to verify that that page in the guest book is correct could easily front-run the transactions and order them in a way that they would place an order, they could see those transactions coming in, and they could easily place an order right before and skew it. So there's certain technical limitations that it's much easier at present to either do batch auctions, so bundling orders all at once and then submitting them to the blockchain, or, well, it's kind of, in the end, it becomes technically quite similar, or you do zero-knowledge proofs where you do a series of computation off the blockchain and submit it to the block.
Does everyone in the audience have a rough idea of how blockchain computation works? or what it actually does or why it does that.
Sure. I mean, maybe even taking it back a step before. So basically, one of the fundamental underpinning ideas of blockchain is like transparency of interaction. And usually it's transparency of transaction. But you could see all of, like in the way that you look at your bank account ledger and see all of the transactions you've recently made. Think of that, but on a kind of global interaction level. So you could see any transactions that happen between any people, fundamentally. Of course, your names wouldn't be tied to them or other things like that, but it's fundamentally just a public ledger or record. And the idea with like zero knowledge proof, it's kind of a fancy word for a type of computation, but the idea that, the thing is like people talk about privacy and blockchain and various things, but if you want to trace like one identity's actions across time, it's super easy to do that. It's super transparent. And that's not necessarily, if you know who belongs to this particular identity, that's not super secure. So zero knowledge proofs are a way to do the transaction and then basically put information that you can trace back.
As minor, meaning regardless.
You could do it in any form, just off-chain. There's a kind of, if we want to, there's a kind of like metaphysical sense of like on-chain and off-chain. And you push a bunch of transactions on-chain, but with more less readily available identity information. I don't really necessarily want to go into zero proofs more than that, but you can just think of like something happens over here and then there's a record of it here that's like less identity ridden, if that makes sense. Does that kind of make sense?
So like the basic idea is that like if we go back to the Bitcoin, which is like the first blockchain.
Yeah.
So it is, I mean, the idea how the Bitcoin could replace currencies is that it's because you have all the transactions that has been accomplished by the Bitcoin, which are written in the blockchain, and it's undefeasible. You cannot revert, you cannot erase it.
That is the idea. In my opinion, it needs to be battle tested a bit more because there are certain issues that may arise with that, but that is the fundamental idea. And there's people in like immutable camps who think never turn back the ledger, never turn back time. Because there's this thing called working in definitions again. There's this term called the hard fork, which is actually creating a new chain. You can think of that like taking a guest book and being like, I don't believe in this guest book anymore, we're going to put a new guest book on the table. And this is now the correct guest book, and we're only going to enter names in the guest book, this one from now on. And you could do that where you choose a certain point in time from which you hard fork. So there was a hard fork in Ethereum that happened due to an issue in 2016.
And so it's consensus, everyone had to agree.
The miners have to agree primarily.
The issue being the DAO?
Yeah.
Okay. That's actually an interesting talking point because it extends the concept of blockchain and the whole philosophical metaphysical idea that we're talking about onto a global scale when it comes to sort of everything being run by that. And then next I would like to talk about agency and accountability in these contexts and the role of sort of machining entities, computational entities, and human entities. I think we had a conversation about the figure of the trader and his necessity in the market. And as you might have heard it in blockchain discourses, very often it also comes up that there is inherently buried in it an idea that's very similar to ideas, to earlier ideas from the history of capitalism, like the invisible hand of Adam Smith, or capitalism as sort of a natural law that you find in Marx, because you have the idea that once you hand it over to sort of a neutral technology that just solves an equation somehow and goes through a calculation, that somehow it's foolproof in a way, which of course brings with it certain issues. But yeah.
I mean, what I personally found fascinating in the blockchain was I'm not an expert in this domain, so I had anybody else to very quickly learn whatever I could. What I found interesting is that it's a new technology because it's implemented technologically on networks, etc. But actually, it's very old because all of a sudden, because of that, it made us think again on what money means. I mean, socially, and how to replace money, and how much money is dependent on central authority, and how much truth is dependent on central authority. Because if if you are speaking about the ledger or you are doing a transaction, the main problem is that this is the true one and nobody can falsify it, etc. So these basic ideas, which are very old ideas, they are the metaphysical ideas which are guiding everyone. Strange, I mean, what I find fascinating is that because of the blockchain, they became popular again, and I saw a lot of books being published again because of the blockchain on what money means and who created money and the debate whether there was the barter before exchanging the stuff against money or not, and these kind of ideas. And I believe that the creators of the blockchain were like anthropologists at first, and Zaga, that you cite often.
They're technically pseudonymous to the creator. But yes, the group of people originally working around blockchain were of a more theoretical ilk as well.
So I find this fascinating because it seems to me that really understanding what it is, you have to go back to the history of humankind almost, and all the fascinating stories about, I don't know what tribe in what island had already invented a form of money that didn't even need to change hands. It was sitting in one place, and all you had to do is to know that this money represents the fact that you've transacted with somebody else. At some point they wanted to transport it in the sea, and it fell in the sea, and nevertheless it still worked because everybody knew that it's there in the sea. So the reference of truth was still existent.
Yeah, and this I find so interesting, this sort of mythological aspect of it, that becomes even more true once it becomes a completely highly technological entity, is that in one way it seems completely, how do you say, mundane, you know, it's just, but on the other hand it's the creation of truth itself, which of course, as you say, can be traced back in history, I don't know, for example, to the Baroque, where you had the first mathematical tools for prediction in the form of calculus, and the first forms of really well-functioning symbolic logic. You have philosophers and mathematicians like Leibniz who said, like, we don't have any problems anymore, we can just calculate everything. It's like, there's no need for fighting or anything, not even for policy or the prediction, you can just put a formula on it. And ultimately it's the creation of truth, so the value is actually just a form of truth.
Yeah, and I think it kind of opens up this dubious ontological space as well, and this kind of cultural narrative of as soon as you start being able to rethink value in contemporary society, you're able not only to rethink money or the institutions or financial instruments, but you're also able to rethink institutions in the sense of how much overhead does it take to interact with another person in an institution, and also kind of to what extent does it require overhead to be able to, there's this whole kind of cultural phrase of trustlessness, so I don't have to be able to trust you to interact with you.
That's the blockchain.
Yes.
Blockchain solves this.
Well, that's kind of what it aims to be, but it's created this kind of like cultural feedback loop of people then questioning, well, why isn't trust good? And what is this kind of like, what is the purpose of like societal connections and the point of like not being able to trust each other and etc. And it's created this kind of like reflexive loop within the culture of the industry that hasn't resolved itself yet.
How do you think all of this, what are the ideological manifestations of it? Because in my experience, and I would like to ask the question mainly to you, because in blockchain we've experienced it over the past years. And in the beginning with Bitcoin especially, and I have a question in the meantime for you, which is like, why do you think Bitcoin? Was it sort of just to make people engage with it, attach money to a technological concept?
Well, I think Joinery, she's a writer, has done a lot of amazing work on this, and also deriving this answer partly from her. A lot of the original intention of the first kind of Bitcoin white paper, there's a kind of funny joke that maybe it was just solving a problem of computation and being able to have a bunch of computers to be able to talk to each other and know that what they were saying to each other was in fact accurate. So the idea of sending one message to another and having that know that it was the true message. So it was actually solving a problem of computation, not a problem of value. But the original impetus was not necessarily one that was anti-capitalist. It actually potentially fit very well with a hybrid form of capitalism. It was not necessarily something protesting against it. It was mainly more of a way to be able to transact value and have a series of people and networked computers be able to do that securely, rather than one that was ideologically kind of anti-institution, which I think is now very much painted as.
Which is now being the case. So So now it's being advertised as being something which is against the state.
But I think it was at some point, right?
I mean,
in the beginning, your days.
Yeah, sorry. No, it's fine. No, you go actually, I'm curious.
Oh no, I had the feeling that in the beginning it was hailed from all, and you were hearing about Bitcoin and the blockchain and it sort of being sort of a forebear of maybe a viable alternative to capitalist transactions as we know them.
And then we even talk about crypto communism, right?
Yeah, there was crypto anarchism and everything, you name it. But then at some point I realized, and I think it was when I came upon the work I did in Colombia, that it was sort of an ideological pendulum that didn't just go from left to right, but actually circled all the way around, and created a whole spectrum, which I find in its ramifications outwards again to sort of non-technological society very interesting, because it created a whole new spectrum of sort of technology, market-based ideologies in politics that sort of gave a glimpse of what's about to come, I think, the sort of new interactions between politics, economics, and ideologies that we haven't really faced yet, but that are definitely changing as we speak all the time.
Yeah, I would just say I misspoke slightly there in the sense that it wasn't necessarily not anti-institution. I would say it was properly anti-institution, but it was not necessarily anti-capitalist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the question I wanted to ask you, Elie, because both of us weren't really there when you started doing this. When I just had my first year of elementary school when you entered the market and ruined it for us. Thank you. No, but could you sort of trace the ideologies from the 1980s to now that sort of came with derivative trading, the politics of it, the philosophies of it a little bit for us? Could you give us a little insight?
Yeah, but basically the whole industry started really when in 1973 there was a formula that was discovered by three people who won the Nobel Prize later. And it's the formula where volatility is the main parameter, as I said, which allows everyone who had a pocket computer in those days to compute the value of derivatives. And so that happened in 73. And really this formula, the Black and Scholes formula, was really the beginning of the whole industry which I'm in, so now 2 years later. However, why 73? Because in 71 there was the Bretton Woods agreement and the dollar was no longer pegged. There was no longer the gold standard. So in the early 70s, this was really the origin, according to this narrative, of the idea that value no longer existed. So it's no longer something which is gold that more or less guaranteed the value of the dollar. The dollar became free floating. So the whole idea that things free float in the market and just go up or down because of supply or demand really became a big idea then, and that's why things became volatile, because only the prices fluctuated. And in those days, that's why people were researching formulas to, as soon as something is fluctuating, meaning the dollar exchange rate or the value of the gold or whatnot, it's there that you start to seek insurance. So it's there that you want somebody to sell you an insurance that the value of your stock or the value of your dollar portfolio does not fall against the gold. And this is why you need derivatives. As soon as you go to some bank and tell the bank, sell me insurance that my holdings will not go below a certain level, in terms of derivatives, it means that the bank is selling you a put option, or an option that guarantees your losses below a certain level. And as soon as you want the bank to be able to tell you what premium it wants to charge you for this insurance, this is when you need the Black and Scholes formula, where the key parameter, as I said, is what you think, or what the bank thinks the volatility of the dollar against the gold is going to be. So as soon as markets and the history of finance entered into that phase where value no longer existed and you had only exchange rates of anything against anything. So if I say that the price of gold in dollar is $1,000, you could understand that by being the price of dollar against gold. So there's no longer any fixed reference. It's always price of something against something else, keeping in mind that the currency itself may become worthless tomorrow in case of hyperinflation. So as soon as you have things where you no longer have any ground for value, and it all becomes a surface of prices like waves trading all the time, you enter a phase where not only metaphysically you need to completely change your mind, but also you will need new tools, like derivatives, for instance, to guarantee things. And this is when the financial market entered into the phase of derivatives, when on top of dollar, gold, oil, commodities, whatnot, stocks, bonds, people started trading actively derivatives. So typically those instruments that will guarantee that the price of something would not, or would pay the losses that you would incur if the prices of something would fall below something else, or alternatively would allow you to buy something at a cheaper price if the price of that thing went up. So these are calls and puts. So they became very fashionable once that formula was discovered, and this is how the industry exploded, and banks started hiring scientists and mathematicians like myself until '87, which is the day when I started, when from '73 to '87 this industry became huge. And if you take a country like France, where I started doing trading, we were under like socialism in those cases. Nevertheless, they were the ones who opened up the market and said, we want to unregulate and make the markets go free. So that was a major fashion. And in '87, because derivatives became very liquid, and market makers, like the bank that employed me, started becoming experts in valuing derivatives and offering them to the public and exchanges, this is when the crash happened, because there was so much liquidity built into derivatives, and all of them using the Black-Scholes formula, that the formula failed, because if everybody's using it, you tear it apart, more or less. I can explain why it happened. So '87 was the end of the Black-Scholes model, which was very simplistic, and the beginning of the real derivatives market. Because according to me, because I come from a generation that after the crash, according to me, the market crash was really the beginning of the derivatives market, where no formula any longer constrained the value of derivatives, but derivatives themselves became free-floating in their own markets. So I came in the generation where we as market makers would trade not only one option, but virtually 1,000 different options, and each one of them has a different price, and you could no longer connect the whole scatter of prices with one formula. So, today this is still very active and it's growing, and at the end of the 90s, there's the creation of the VIX index, which is the volatility index. So the volatility index is something that says volatility itself you can now trade. So it's as if you are building now a new layer of derivatives on the first layer. So that's a very also interesting idea according to me, because as soon as derivatives become, as I said, freely trading in their own market, they become themselves a stock that trade. So therefore you can write derivatives on the derivatives, and there is no end to this chain. So that's, sorry.
No, I'm very curious about your experience, and particularly this, thinking through when all price is basically relational, and there are many multiple layers of that relation, because still fundamentally there are a few national currencies towards which everything is equivalent or pegged. But there's a certain tendency, I think, of just finance in general to take kind of smaller and smaller, more discrete or more semantic information and put a specific asset or a specific kind of like price or financial or technical instrument on top of it to assign it, to make it tradable or to make it exchangeable and in relation to something else. So do you see kind of like a world that, I mean, maybe you already kind of inhabit this world and not everyone sees it yet, but like, do you see a world of like really kind of multi-currency, like, because I'd say that we have maybe like 3 polarities of main pegged currencies at the moment. Do you see that kind of national dominion or institutional dominion changing?
So meaning what, towards one currency or?
Meaning towards many, many multiple ones. Like,
oh,
do you know what I mean?
I don't know. No, probably not. Probably will stay like this, like maybe a few. No.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So, just a question about this VIX index.
VIX index.
Maybe I need to discuss the back. So, how is it made up?
also, I mean, if you take like a major market like the S&P, so the S&P is the index of all the stocks in America, so it's a very important measure of how well the economy of America, therefore Europe, if you take the dollar as a thing, is doing. This is a major market, the S&P. And if you look at options, meaning calls and puts, which trade on the S&P every second, there are every second 5,000 option trading. So again, to repeat, an option is like, if you assume that the value of the equity index is like 1,000, and you want to trade bets of whether it will go above 1,100, above 1,200, above 1,400, or below 900, below 800, etc. So you have different strike levels, as we call them, that you wish to bet whether that index is going to go above or below, and at what time horizons. So this gives you two dimensions. What the future, what your bet is that the future price of that thing is going to be above levels or below levels, at what maturities. So this gives you an array of options, and there are actually 5,000 of them that currently trade every day. And as I said, the major parameter to price them is volatility. According to Black and Scholes, when the whole industry started, that number volatility was supposed to be fixed, and nobody, I mean, God would whisper it to your ear. I mean, there was no way that you could compute volatility, and people would just statistically find out what volatility was, until we discovered, after the '87 crash, that volatility itself was volatile. So, because it's volatile, so it became, remember what I said earlier, I said there's no value, there's only price. What Black-Scholes did is put back all of the derivatives back into the valuation paradigm, because they provided us with a formula to evaluate options, to put values on options. Because I'm saying, no, there is no such thing as a value. So value has to be destroyed again, and this is what happened in '87. The valuation formula of Black-Scholes blew up. Volatility, which was supposed to become the new fundamental value of the market, was no longer fixed. It became itself stochastic, and therefore, according to my principle, it has to become itself tradable, because there is no value, there's only price. So only the market can put a price on volatility, and hence the VIX. So the VIX is what the market consensus is on the value of volatility itself, which becomes a price, not a value. So now volatility itself is tradable. So we're moving to another level. Volatility itself becomes a commodity that you trade, and you can write options on volatility. So you have today VIX options. And my speculation is that it never ends. So in the end, to go back to ideology, whenever I talk about all this, and what actually I'm criticizing basically here is the fact that there is not only that there is no value, but that there is no statistics. So nobody can tell me what volatility, which is the statistical measure of how wide the fluctuation of the stock is. Nobody, based on the history, can tell me what is going to be in the future. So there is no way you can inspect historical data and get statistics from it and project volatility. So in the end, what I'm saying is that as soon as you are facing a thing which is as massive as the market of the S&P, there is no algorithm, there is no statistician, there is no analyst that can tell you that the stock not only is going to go up or down, but how volatile it's going to be. It's always the market which gives you information about itself. So what you are looking here is at a new machine, which we call the market, that is replacing statistics. So according to me, this is not ideological. It has nothing to do with capitalism. It's only saying that finance, as far as finance is concerned, the market itself becomes the new tool to predict itself. So it's not, it's really the future of the market itself is given by the market. And as I said, it never ends. So all the statistical parameters eventually become tradable.
The eternal market.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I say this because people also here, and you are all worried about automation of the market. This is what you mentioned. Everyone is worried about the algorithms taking over trading, and machines becoming in charge of predicting the value of stuff. What I'm trying to explain to you is that this cannot happen, because any algorithm that is supposed to automatically trade something is based on the internal parameters of the algorithm. So the algorithm has to know, has to learn from the history what statistically the behavior of something is going to be, and he has to project that into the future to try to predict it. But I'm saying that any statistical parameters themselves are going to change in the market. So any algorithm that people who are running algorithmic trading are running will ultimately be beaten by somebody who is trading a derivative which is making the statistical parameter tradable.
So don't be scared.
Yeah, so don't be scared. Algorithms are not going to take over finance. I don't know about how.
And so they learn how to play wrong and like actually actively update the parameters that it can accept. But yeah.
So yeah, no value, just price. It's a good credo for Basel these days, I guess. Maybe because we're already almost at an hour, I would like the audience to ask some questions if you want to.
One simple question: is the hard market of interest for you in these thoughts or concepts, or is it too small or too unimportant compared to other markets, or is it because of its specific?
Also
Because
very
it's so
important.
specific, a market where you could try out things that are kind of.
No, it's very important because when everything becomes worse, there's only art will remain. So. Yeah, it's true. Because, I mean, what's the price?
Do you have a collection?
No, I'm trying to turn my software into artwork. So. Yeah, because I mean, what's the value of?
Is the art market still the market of stuff? And we could actually think of an art market that puts on the derivative on the art. Actually, we could speculate on this. Isn't that what we are doing basically? Just not in such a sophisticated. We're still trading stuff here, right? This is what the art market is, trading stuff.
Yes.
It's like an old market. But we can put something new on this old market, as we did it on oil, as we did it on gold, as we could, actually bet on what's the Chef Koons going to be in 2 years, and we're selling this, and not Chef Koons.
Yeah, you can create indices that tell you what the price is.
Why isn't this happening? Why isn't art part of this? Why aren't we trading art like this? Because it's so air.
Maybe it's not liquid enough.
Regulation.
Yes. Oh, okay.
But then we'll open up, actually, a whole, it's like we're going back to 73 now, it's like the art market before 73, as it seems. But actually, who needs the storage, who needs the soil dynamic, who needs the why? We're trading prices.
Because it's a ruse.
No, it's an illusion, or it's like, isn't it?
No, you need some, like Jeff Koons is a really good derivative of something, definitely.
There is no yet. We need to, we need to make it up. We need to make it true. We need to say, well, Gaussian is not selling pieces on the wall. Gaussian is selling value. There's going to be value in the future. We basically do that anyways. That's why we're having prices that we have them, because we're betting, but we're not betting in like in a market sense. We're doing it in like an old-fashioned way of like having stuff in storage instead of like selling the idea of the value
I think
later.
there's also a sociological and anthropological layer in which you are doing status derivatives. Like status derivatives, in the sense of kind of basically staking a claim on a future worth of a current work, and also trading it on a sociological level.
I mean, I was going exactly also to speak out because there is a whole sociology also of contemporary art, if I understand well. I mean, there's the whole play of the fair, of the gallery, of the... So no, it's such a shame to replace all this by just, some hedge fund which is like running an index of... Why not? I mean, of course, but I don't think it will dispense from the crowd.
No, we can still meet up. I mean, we still do parties, This is
Oh.
like part of the
But they do parties in finance,
It's like,
so...
people, exactly, being in black doesn't mean that we don't do parties, this is not, I mean, I think it's just like, it would be a very, I don't understand why it's not out there, to be we are.
Probably
I don't
because of
understand
liquidity,
what-
probably because there's a lot of stuff, as you're saying. It's not like gold or like the S&P, or you have to bundle maybe the works of art and create an index. It's being done, no? I think there are hedge funds who do this. Or
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of work being put into fractional ownership, and that's something that, you know, instead of the addition, you get the fractional ownership of one piece of work, and you sell that on secondary markets, etc. I think that is quite soon incoming. There's just a lot of kind of social and regulatory issues with that. But maybe we'll see something like the 70s quite soon.
the nice thing about finance is that it's money talking to money. You see, it's like some people might find this boring, but actually there's this. So I mean.
Do you have a question?
Well, I was saying that, I mean, finance maybe is a category of its own because it's the value of stock that you are speculating against, and the stock is something that you sell immediately against money, and the stock is something that gives you dividends. So because of this homogeneity, it's much easier in finance. So you have mathematical theorems that in finance that you cannot, I think, transpose to the art market as easily.
But I think it goes back to the King's beauty contest, where everyone's kind of boat meeting each other and kind of betting on the painting that will sell for the most in the 5 to 10 year scope. So I think there's also a certain point that if money is always in flux and always in exchange, and it's not even necessarily price anymore, like it's attached enough from value to become price, and then at a certain point it's just kind of information. And it's just an information, like price can, and I think in the art context, that's where it's like, you don't even need necessarily kind of another layer of meaning or semantics on top of it. I think that's maybe the largest kind of social barrier there as well, is because you need, you deal in a certain form of status that's very hard to compress to kind of one bit of information. Like until we have like human sociological status that has nuance that can be translated from one exchange to another or a single price point, that would be hard. But if you do status in the kind of waves of information and zoom out a bit at large, then it's easy. I think, I don't know.
So maybe one day there could be.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as an artist, I do hope that there is some form of inbuilt kind of equity, or some. I really hope that there's someone gets a little bit in the back door with the kind of tech and regulation that will enable this, so that there is a certain. A lot of the promise of the tech that I work in is like by participating in something and participating in a software system, you by default become a co-owner of it. Could be in the essence of like if you buy a coffee at the coffee shop, you ultimately pay into the equity of the coffee shop. I really hope someone figures out how to put this into the tech side of art, where if you kind of own part of an artwork or produce part of an artwork, you thereby profit from it over the long term. But I'm not super optimistic.
You've both already answered my final question, which is the outlook of how this could all develop further. Do we have any more contributions or questions to both our great panelists? In that case, I would say thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, don't be afraid.